Across the world, we are faced with numerous questions, but one that's quite pertinent happening across continents right now is the problem of evil and suffering. How do we reconcile it in the context of wars that happen? And that's what we're going to explore in this episode. Hey everyone, welcome to SAF Podcast. It's a delight to have you here as we move towards the final bit of this year. I hope you've had a great time tuning in to the previous episodes, and we have covered a wide variety of topics. We've looked at some, those are very specific to India, and also we've looked at general Christian apologetics topics as well. But this episode is something that is very special to us and also something that is very pertinent. We are going to look at the problem of evil and suffering, but with a unique perspective. And to give us that perspective, I am so delighted to welcome back to SAF Podcast our very good friend, Lukas Ruegger. Lukas, welcome back to SAF Podcast.
Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
It's been a long while ago since you had been on the podcast. And I don't think we need to introduce you much to our audience. Lukas, if you're not familiar, Lukas runs the ever popular Christian apologetics YouTube channel Deflate and has been doing some tremendous work in producing high quality Christian apologetics content out there. So do check out, we'll be linking his channel in the description for you to check out some of his amazing work. But Lukas is also someone who I admire a lot. I come across a lot of Christian apologists who do apologetics in that very niche format. They take up apologetics topics, do talks, go to churches, training sessions, and so on and so forth. But Lukas is someone who values conversations and bridge building a lot. I'm not saying that others don't, but in Lukas, I'm able to see someone who is able to take that into very specific areas. I think, Lukas, that also comes from the fact that you are in Lebanon right now as we speak, while Lebanon is undergoing intense conflict and war right now. I think that would be the way to put it. There is actual war happening in Beirut where you are, where there is intense airstrikes and as such. So, Lukas, how is the situation right now on the ground for you? I mean, this is going to be outdated information when the podcast comes out. But right now, as you and your family are there, how is the situation in Beirut?
Yeah, so we live around 7.5 kilometers, or that would be maybe some 5 miles, 4 or 5 miles away from the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is the Hezbollah stronghold. And obviously the war is happening between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah. And so we've been, over the past weeks, we've been hearing the strikes that have happened in, again, that southern suburb. Some of them were very loud, very intense. Often at night, sometimes the windows would shake or the whole, even doors would shake, especially the ones when they targeted the key leaders like Nasrallah and his successor. These were some very heavy strikes. And then also, there's kind of drones directly over our heads almost 24/7. So yeah, it's quite an experience living through war. In the last 2 days, there were airstrikes that targeted buses or cars just 5 minutes from the place where our kids go to school. That is 5 minutes from where we live. The school is right next door. And yeah, our kids are aged 13, 11, and 7. So they can they understand what's happening. They're interested. They follow the news to a certain extent as well. But still, some of the incidents were quite scary. When it gets loud and the strikes are intense, again, at night, the house at certain points was shaking, and then I would be worried about the kids and stuff. And just life is very different. Lebanese people are at the moment, obviously everyone feels very unstable, very insecure. People don't leave the house at night, which affects also our work and ministry. And yeah, it's what's happening at the moment is quite historic in the sense that power, the kind of the centers of power are being shifted, and we'll see what happens once all of this is over. But it's definitely, Jacob, the thing is, they say when you go through trauma. I'm not saying that I'm kind of traumatized or anything, but there were certainly moments over the past couple of weeks where I felt, man, this is crazy. You're in bed and strikes every 20 minutes or so, and you hear it and it's boom, boom. That is crazy. And so I'm still, when you make these experiences, it becomes hard to kind of assess yourself. One thing I realize, I'm just far more tired than I usually am. I need far more sleep than I would usually need. So emotionally, the whole situation is definitely draining. There is just this very dark and heavy atmosphere that looms over the country, and I guess over the whole region anyway. So, but again, at this stage, I feel I think it's hard for me to really discern myself and how this is, impacting me. I know that it does impact me. I also know that I can function fairly normally, but at the same time, what is under the surface is, I have to wait till the whole thing is over and then look back and, again, dig a bit deeper and see, okay, what has really happened here. So, yeah.
I mean, as you said, even though things are quite safe for you at present, but still going through what you're going through, just listen to it. We can't fathom what others are going through. Those who are in refugee camps, those who have lost dear ones in these conflicts that has been happening both in Gaza and in Lebanon. People who are still waiting for their hostages to be released, who were taken captive from October 7th. I mean, it's really harrowing. And this is happening all across the world, in Africa, in Asia, Middle East, Europe, Ukraine, Russia is still going on. And these conflicts, while we see it in the news, it's quite easy for us to politicize this and say, oh, this is, the axis of resistance going against the West. Or if you look at China and it's turned against Taiwan, it's very easy for us to politicize this. But once we start listening into stories and once we see the ground reality, it's very difficult for us to look at it as pure statistics. Maybe it's because of the fact that we are all quite safe and far away from this, that this doesn't look like reality to us. Until no, especially when I heard the news of the attacks happening in Beirut, I was really quite worried about you and your family, and that's when the strikes in Beirut became very personal to me. Until that was happening, these strikes or attacks happening in different parts of the world were just conflicts. We read it in news; it's just conflict. But I believe this is where our Christian convictions and values definitely stand out. It's in these places of being tested. And we've seen this across Christian history. We always say that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The point is, it's in these moments of excruciating pain and suffering and loss that Christianity outshines every other worldview and philosophy, because it has got much more to offer that others can't even fathom. And what really stands out is, when these conflicts normally happen, we would hear updates from different governments advising the citizens to stay away, like leave the country. British, US have advised citizens to stay away from Lebanon. But you're not a native Lebanese. Now, given your nature of work, I'm not going to give out too much information. I'll let you be the judge of that. But you're not a native Lebanese. You could move out back to your native country with your family and be safe with your kids there. What is prompting you to stay put in Lebanon, even with the possibility that your family could very much still be in high danger?
Good question. So to give a bit of context, we're originally from Switzerland. We've lived and served here for the past 12 and a half years. And 2 years ago, we've built a ministry over the years, which kind of climaxed in us establishing an event cafe in the center of Beirut 2 years ago, which has become like a consolidating and like a consolidating hub for everything we used to do before in other coffee shops or in event venues, gathering people from different backgrounds to have conversations about faith or conversations about worldview. Again, we had a whole, out of these activities, we had a whole network that grew of, again, people from very different backgrounds, very different religious and cultural backgrounds who were all interested in sharing in conversations about worldview and the meaning of life and God, faith, and so on and so forth. Again, we established this cafe 2 years ago. It's become very much a hub where communities being built, where these conversations continue to happen. And I mean, I'm now in the process of handing over this work to our Lebanese leaders. I mean, the whole team. I mean, among volunteers and paid staff, there's a total of around 15 people, and I'm the only expat at this stage, or me and my wife are the only expats, and we're just about to hand over, like fully, the entire leadership to our Lebanese leaders. And for me, it was the reason why we're staying is because we feel very much that God has called us to be and serve in this place. And at this stage, even though operationally speaking, if you will, I'm not that involved anymore, because again, like, things are being handed over and things work very well without my operational involvement. But I want to set an example to the Lebanese leaders who I'm mentoring now by saying, well, I don't just run away when conflict happens. I don't run away when things get tough. If God has called us to be here, and if God has called us to serve here alongside our Lebanese brothers and sisters, well, that applies for good times and bad times. And, when our Lebanese brothers and sisters in Christ, they're staying kind of standing their ground. So let me be here with them. It's, again, even though it may not make that much of a difference if I left as far as operations or activities are concerned. Again, the Lebanese leaders who we've raised, they're more than capable of continuing the work and of carrying on. But it's about making being like fellowship in suffering. It's about being there with our people. Again, the believing leaders and the team of believers who lead the work, and the the non-believing youth who we're trying to reach, making a statement and saying, well, actually, guys, we're sticking it out with you. We're not running away. We believe, that God has called us here, and that calling applies for whatever season or for whatever situation may obtain. And we just stay here. That's what it is. Yeah.
That is quite remarkable, and I think that is just a glimpse of numerous other Christians in different parts of the world who are living out that very same conviction. And with that, we come to the key apologetics bit of what we're talking about, the problem of evil and suffering. And this has been an age-old question. All through the Old Testament, through other philosophers, every ideology has at one point asked, why do we see the suffering around? And when it comes to Christianity or theism in general, the question is a bit more direct. If God exists, why is there evil and suffering? And you have done videos on the problem of animal suffering and how it's poses a challenge to atheism and as such. But within the context of general evil and suffering, it is a deep philosophical question. As we both know, there's so much that we can go into different approaches, different theodicies to explain it. But as someone who has engaged with this topic a lot, and as someone who is right in the heart of active evil and suffering, when someone asks you, Lukas, if God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering? How do you present your answer?
Yeah. As you said, Jacob, there are, different pathways of presenting or crafting a theodicy, and also an important kind of marker to establish at the outset of the conversation about suffering is that every worldview has to face that question, no matter whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a naturalist or a Muslim. You've got to face that question. It's it is the most, or like the key question that a person has to face, or that, again, a worldview has to face. And so, coming to an answer, I mean, obviously Christianity has all sorts of resources and again, pathways to craft theodicies, and we can get into some of them. But I think the key thing that distinguishes the Christian worldview's capacity to answer this question from any other worldview's capacity is the following. It is that Christianity proclaims a crucified God. And what that means is that the ultimate ground of being that Christianity postulates, that is God, has taken on human form and has experienced all sorts of human suffering, and the ultimate type of human suffering, which is death. And I mean, this has huge implications in the following sense. I believe that most people, when they ask the question of suffering, most of the time when this question is being asked, it is being asked from an emotional or existential angle. And by that, I mean, it's not so much, the question is not so much asked as a, philosophical exercise or an intellectual exercise in the sense of, well, what is the best answer to figure this one out? I really want to figure this one out like a mathematical problem or something. No, people ask this question because every one of us, is going to be faced with some sort of evil or suffering during their lifetime. The loss of a loved one, a terminal illness, that may strike one, loss of job or some other situation a person may go through. And that's, you're coming at this question, or you're asking this question really from the experience of going through suffering yourself. And what I believe is that when we're asking this question, again, when we're existentially posing this question or emotionally putting up this question, what we ultimately need is not a philosophical or intellectual answer. What we need is not so much information. I could give you, and all sorts of political analysts and experts are giving their answers to why the Middle East conflict is happening, and all the centers of power and how they correlate with each other and what is happening and geopolitics and what have you. Like there's all sorts of ways to explain what is happening, even on a technological level. You can explain how the pager explosion caused suffering, and medically what happens to a person when they get struck by when they're affected by a bomb or whatever. There are all sorts of information that is out there and that can be obtained. But really, that's not what we're after when we're faced with suffering. We don't need information. What we need is fellowship in suffering. What we need is someone who is able to stand with us or to sit with us, to listen to us, to cry with us, and to say, man, I've been there myself, or I've been in very similar situations, and I've experienced trauma, and I've experienced, that sort of loss, and I've experienced pain, and I think I know how you feel. I'm with you in this. I'm with you. And I give you my listening ear. I give you my kind of, like, I put my heart into this. I want to show you empathy. That's really what we need. Again, far more than information. And so Christianity, by proclaiming a crucified God, is basically saying that, well, again, the ground of all being is able to offer that empathy, is able to tell us, well, Jacob, or whoever you are, I know how you're feeling as you're going through this, because I myself have been there. In fact, I've gone through death. And so I know exactly how suffering feels. And so at the very outset of tackling this question, because again, let's remember that everyone has to answer this question. Every worldview has to give an account for evil. I think what makes Christianity stand out is that it can legitimately proclaim a ground of being, or it posits a ground of being that is not removed from suffering, but that has fully immersed itself, or who has fully immersed himself and embraced suffering, And therefore, as Hebrews 4 says, we don't have a high priest who's not able to feel with us. No, we have a high priest who's been there with us. Like, he knows what it feels like when we go through trials. So yeah, that would be my kind of. I think that is really the key to offering a Christian answer to the problem of evil. I think it has to revolve around the crucified God, and then obviously again, and I'm happy to talk about this. I mean, there's the soul-making theodicy. There's obviously the free will defense, and these are all valuable responses, and they all have their place. But I think at the very center of a Christian account of evil and suffering has to be the crucified God.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Alvin Platinger puts forward the Felix Culpa, like the good mistake idea, where he points out and says that it is only in a fallen world where sin and evil and suffering permeates that we would see the greatest display of God's wonder, the incarnation. Yeah. And the atonement take place. And so in that sense as well, we get to experience and know God in a way that we otherwise can't when we look at the incarnation and the atonement, the crucifixion of our Christ and Lord. And that also, I believe, is where, like, as you exactly pointed out, in this engagement with the problem of evil and suffering, it's often coming from a place where we want an instant answer. And that's applicable to us Christians as well. Like, when we go through something and we ask, why God? Our the driving force is give me an answer right now. And so we find it very difficult, and it's very, very difficult for us to be patient in that period of pain and suffering. So it's very much understandable how others who are looking at it from an external perspective, who have no game with the Christian worldview, to also find it very impatient and find it very frustrating to not know, to be in unknown as to why this is happening. I don't know. I'm not able to recall who exactly said this, but I remember a Christian thinker who pointed out saying, when you look at the Christian worldview and you see Christ on the cross, the immediate question is, what is God doing on a cross? That's exactly the point. What is God doing on a cross? I mean, what sort of a God are you presenting who suffers with humans, who suffers on behalf of humans? Like, where do you see this in any of other worldviews or philosophies or ideologies out there? Where this God, who is not seen as one among other gods, where this God is not seen in a battle with among gods, but this is the epitome of reality, the very foundation of reality, the supreme being, who is then on the cross, suffering with us humans. And I personally believe that the image of Christ on the cross, however we want to capture that image, be it in sculpture, painting, or visualizing it, that gives us that sense of immense fellowship that words can't. Because when we, at least right now, when we conjure up the image of Christ on a cross, it is immensely moving. And so that image of the cross reverberates throughout history, be it in impacting men and women to speak up and write poems and speeches that capture it, try to capture it in some way, or be it the way it has transformed disciples to be bold witnesses later on, to live out their lives ever so confidently because of a Lord who has stood up for them and stood in their place for them, fulfilling the atonement. In so many ways, that has moved people. And I believe that's also what should be moving us Christians when we look at the problem of evil and suffering. Not just in the way where we have an answer, but also in the way that we are able to provide that answer. That we preach, because as you said, every worldview has to account for it. That's a fact. Atheism, Islam, everything has to make sense of it. And so theistic worldviews like Islam and Judaism and Hinduism all come up with their own explanations for it. But we Christians are able to provide something that is extremely powerful in making sense, in consoling ourselves. And I believe our sense of conviction in knowing how we are able to come to terms with this problem should not just be secluded in us coming to terms with it, but as you pointed out, in us providing that answer and living it out for others, being active, actual place of fellowship for those who need it. And that's exactly the case. I mean, that's what you're also doing right now in Lebanon, staying back and being there for the people. Yeah. Now, as we talk about the problem of evil and stuff, like you said, there are so many ways to look at it, even within Christian theology, in terms of answers. But is there one philosophical answer that strikes you as like your go-to one, the one that you're most convinced with, the one that you're most impressed with or most captivated by?
Yeah, I think again another key kind of marker I would put down at the outset of the conversation, once you get into again navigating or mapping philosophical answers to that question, is we have to be clear that, you know, first of all, we need to ask what type of evil or suffering are we talking about? Because it is not the case that the Christian, or anyone for that matter, a Muslim or a Hindu or an atheist, has to give a one-fits-all answer to the problem of evil. Because fact is, there are different kinds of evil or suffering. You know, there's evil caused by natural disaster. There's evil, like there's moral evil that is, you know, caused by human decisions. And, you know, that you could, there's different ways of categorizing evil. Like there's gratuitous evil, like, or pointless evil and that sort of stuff. And so I think it's important to realize that, again, that the answer that the Christian gives doesn't have to, you know, plug into all the different types of evil. It doesn't have to respond to different types of evil. So I would say, I mean, right at the outset, like a Christian answer to the problem of natural evil is very different from the Christian answer to the problem of moral evil, because these are two very different questions. You know, these are they deal with very different states of affairs. And so as far as, I mean, if we want to hone in on moral evil, I think, you know, the free will defense is, I think, the most, or is a very compelling way to answer, again, the question of moral evil. But I also think, again, that the theodicy of soul making has definitely merit, in the sense that, you know, God uses evil and suffering to build character. Now, obviously, the skeptic can say that, well, you know, why does God have to allow all this evil and suffering just so that you become a better person? Well, that's not quite how it works with the theodicy of soul making. It's more taking into account, okay, we live in a fallen world. That's where we got to by human free will. That is Adam and Eve's free will and all the free will of people down the ages. But God, again, uses those situations and uses our trials in order to build character. And that's something that, you know, that even secular psychologists recognize, or at least, let's say that there is a psychologically acknowledged correlation between trauma or between suffering and character. In the sense, I mean, there is this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, by which psychologists capture the phenomenon that when people come out of suffering, they look back and, you know, surprisingly or remarkably so, would say that, well, as hard as this experience has been, I still, for some reason, would not want to miss it, because it has given me a greater appreciation of, you know, what I have, my family, my life, my health, all the good stuff that is out there. And so, again, this is not something that Christian theologians have come up with only. It's something that is recognized, again, by people in the field of psychology and psychiatry. They say, again, people will come out of such, you know, hard experiences and still, for some reason, you know, affirm that there has been good that has come out of it. And so, yes, soul making is definitely a valid valid pathway to deal with the problem of suffering. Plus, again, I believe that, you know, God values or seems to value human free will and human autonomy, which is linked to our capacity to truly love and to be truly kind. He seems to value that more than just making sure that no one gets to suffer. Now, with free will, what this means is obviously that, well, you do have a real free choice to do either what, God wants you to do, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, or to do the opposite. And if you choose the opposite, it means that human suffering will result from your course of action. And here again, the skeptic may ask, well, is it really worth it? Is all the suffering really worth is free will really worth all that suffering that we have, that we've been dealing with down the ages and down the course of human history? And to this, I would respond and say, well, it seems to me that if you look into culture and into the arts and into movies and listen to music, it's that there are two values that human society seems to cherish more than anything else. And the first one is autonomy, the human capacity to decide on, the course of your life or the course of society. And the other one is the desire and the longing to be loved and to love. And again, these two go hand in hand with each other. You cannot have true love without true human autonomy and free will. And so I do think that we're giving ourselves the answer in the sense of, yes, I mean, all of us really crave, to be autonomous and to be, the agents and the masters of our own destiny. And all of us really crave true love. So it does seem like, yes, even in our own eyes, free will is worth the suffering that we're being faced with.
Yeah. And like I said, there's far more that we can go into it, but that is a quite fitting summary of how the free will and the soul-making explanations work hand in hand. Now, as we move towards the final bits, there are a couple of points for us to cover.
Sure.
On the ground in Lebanon, as you engage with the Christian community, and definitely you are quite engaged with the atheistic community as well, and there's obviously the large proportion of Muslims as well. How do you see each community coming to terms with the conflict? I mean, there's definitely the politics of it. There's definitely the already existing aspects that we have heard across in the news and all of that. But at an individual level, how do you see people from each of these different ideological, philosophical backgrounds look and engage with these conflict?
Yeah, I mean, here it really depends on who you're asking. I mean, Lebanon is very much what we call a sectarian society. That is, all of life, all of society, all of the entire economic market and politics is organized and categorized according to your confession. Like the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Druze, the Orthodox, the Catholics, and what have you. Everyone, all of life is organized this way, which is, I mean, sadly so. And so for the Shiites, who are obviously siding with Hezbollah, I mean, this is a catastrophe, and there's, this is unjust, and this shouldn't be happening, and Israel is trying to get its hands on Lebanon and on Lebanese territory and whatnot, and then obviously the loss of leadership among their ranks. So this is a tragedy. Like it's a tragedy, and it's dark and depressing, and people. I mean, these people suffer. They had to leave again the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is mainly Shiite, other areas which are being targeted. If you ask lots of other people, Christian, the Catholics, the Maronites, the Orthodox, the Sunni Muslims, for them it's not quite like that, because for them it's Lebanon is being sort of liberated from the grip of Hezbollah and the Hezbollah militia. I mean, Hezbollah is not just like a militia; it's also a political party.
Yeah.
But part of one of the key problems in the political landscape in Lebanon has been the fact that Hezbollah is far better armed than the Lebanese army, and that it is and that basically all other parties have constantly requested that Hezbollah hand in its arms to the state, because it's just, I mean, it could basically overturn the state at any time. Now, no one within Lebanon has had or has the capacity or the courage, if you will, to stand up against Hezbollah. And now, I mean, Israel is really, I mean, going on. I mean, they're really going after them. Basically, they've eliminated their whole leadership and significantly diminished their military capacities. And so, if you're asking lots of Christians and lots of Sunnis, they will say, well, actually, this may actually be for the better of the country, you know, and it can flip over to people being really, you know, taking pleasure in what's happening and feeling like, well, this, you know, they deserve that and all of that. Now, for us as a follower of Christ, I mean, you really want to be, I mean, I think at the core of our calling is the responsibility to, you know, to be compassionate and to be, you know, to see, again, as you said at the beginning, Jacob, it's very easy to look from the outside and just see the conflict and see the statistics and see, okay, these against these, and, you know, this is happening. At the heart of it, there are still people, you know, people who are being displaced, people who've lost loved ones, people who go through real trauma. Now, I am not saying that you can't assess, if you will, politically or militarily what's happening here. I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, obviously Israel having, you know, the rockets, like Hezbollah rockets put up at their border, I mean, that's obviously a threat. Like I would understand any nation that says, well, actually, you know, I don't let myself be attacked for a year or so, just constantly while I'm gonna clear this thing up. I'm not saying that you can't make these judgments or that you can't form an opinion about these things. But I am saying that in terms of priority, we need to get this one right as Christians. It's at the end, there are people who are being affected by this. And not just people who are being affected by this, there are people who need reconciliation with God, man. You know, there are people who need salvation, who need the peace of God, you know, against the odds of everything that's happening. There are people who, man, so many times I've talked to our leaders and said, man, it is hard enough as a believer to go through this. And again, there's, you know, it's sometimes scary, and you have the strikes, and you fear about your kids and what have you, and you have the drones over your head, and it's crazy. But at least, I mean, not at least, but as a Christian, you can say, man, I get to ask God to pour out the peace, His peace that surpasses my understanding. Like I've real hope. I've real hope that there's something beyond what's in my face. Now, as if you don't have that, and see how bad is that to experience something as cataclysmic and as traumatic as this? And so, really, this should be at the core of our stance or attitude towards what is happening here. As Christians, we should see, okay, there are people who are suffering, and there are people who Christ died for, and there are people who are in need of reconciliation with God. It doesn't matter on which side of the conflict they're standing, whether they're Israelis or Lebanese or Palestinians or Iranians. It just doesn't matter. You know, for God, there's neither Greek nor Gentile. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. Like all have sinned and all are in need of salvation. And I think that's at the core of how we should be looking at this. And again, I'm not saying that you can't form an opinion about what's happening. But I think forming an opinion should come after your commitment to seek, you know, salvation and reconciliation for those who are lost.
Absolutely. And I think that is the message that needs to go out right now, because we see this very disturbing trend of extremist Christian Zionism, where when irrespective of what theological position that you hold, you know, covenantal theology or anything that you hold with regards to dispensationalism or how the statehood of Israel plays out, and we all know the fact that the land was given to them through Abraham, and there was promise that they would return to the land, and that's all there. As Christians, we all affirm that. But sometimes we see this very disturbing fact that the lives lost in this conflict be it Palestinian lives or Lebanese lives, looked at and said, they deserved it. And it is certainly the case that there are evildoers in among that pile of dead bodies. It's certainly the case that militants and terrorists are there at the receiving end, but no one can deny the fact that no matter what stance you take on the death toll figures or whether they're reliable or not, no one can deny the fact that children and innocent civilians are getting caught in the crossfire. No one denies that. I don't think any nation or any international organization denies that. But oftentimes, driven by the zeal for the land of Israel, we see a lot of Christians, as you say, miss the mark, lose that priority completely out of the picture, where it comes to a point where it's this fervent desire to defend politicians. I mean, we all know that politicians are not always God-honoring men. We know that they're not always truthful, that they have so much of selfish desires. But this idea that Israeli politicians can never lie, or Israeli politicians are always the good guys, has led to a lot of Christians lose the big picture. And there is recurring chastisement of that sort of an idea in the Old Testament, all throughout. The King Ahab is one prime example. We never see anywhere in the Old Testament God just giving the kings of Israel a pass, or because they are in charge, or because they are Israelites, or because they're Jews or anything. Justice was served all throughout. In the book of Hosea, which was a real eye-opener to me when I was reading us, the Hosea is asking the Lord, I mean, yes, we made mistakes, we erred in your ways, but you have brought the Babylonians upon us, and they're doing much further evil. So the gravity of God's judgment upon Israel and the Jewish land was very clear in Hosea's eyes. And we see this all throughout the Old Testament. Jeremiah the prophet, and in the Pentateuch as well, the reminder to not oppress the foreigner and the widow and the orphan, but to care for all. So the idea of this unbridled allegiance towards a nation state is out of touch with the Christian worldview. There is the ground biblical reality of God's promise to the people of Israel. But the idea that the state and the politicians must always be defended leads us to lose sight of where our true allegiance lies. And that is towards the Lamb who was slain, who has come down to redeem all of mankind. As you pointed out, every single one has been presented the opportunity to receive Christ. And I think that's a place where we have to remind ourselves on where our true allegiance lies. And I believe that is also a place where we can err in the global stage. When people wonder, how can Christians be so aloof in the face of this evil and suffering and turn a blind eye towards it? Being in Lebanon, being in the middle of conflict, as we come to this final point, being in Lebanon, being in the middle of conflict, and holding the Christian conviction that we both cherish and many Christians around us cherish, knowing the reality and the biblical part of God's promise to the people of Israel about the land and all of that. How do you navigate these conversations, or how do you navigate the way you look at this conflict, seeing the necessity of self-defense and as such, but also the harrowing reality of life that is lost?
Yeah. I'm at the moment. I think for me, really, the key is to have conversations with real people, man. I mean, it's the first time I'm living in a situation of war. I've never had this before. And one of the things I realized, Jacob, is that in war, much more than in any other life situation I've lived, it becomes so apparent how people just fall for their biases. And how just things get so emotional, and people who are otherwise so nuanced, suddenly it's not that they stop being nuanced or self-reflective, but it's just that you suddenly lose those the guards are lowered in a negative sense. I mean that you just fall for propaganda or for quasi propaganda, and that's a shame, man. I see. But again, it applies to me too. It's like, I fall for, sometimes I feel like, oh man, really? Like, yeah, seriously. I mean, these guys can never be like, of course, these guys deserve it, or this should have happened. Like, it's great that this has happened, what have you. But for me, and I guess this is maybe the privilege of being here, is it's talking to real people, man. It's talking to real people. And I mean, I'm blessed enough to have friends, Israeli friends I get to talk to, and we talk about this, people who are based in Israel. And it's, I get to talk to these people. I get to talk to Lebanese. I get to talk to Palestinians. I get to talk to Shiites. I mean, 2 days ago, I played, like once a week, I play football. And since recently, there's a bunch of young Shiite people who come like right from the Hezbollah neighborhood that have been joining. And man, it's so good to have these guys around. It's just, I mean, these guys, obviously, so they're from the Hezbollah camp, if you want. But man, 17 years old, 19 years old, they have their future ahead of them. And it's all just being destroyed right in their face, being displaced, not being able to continue with their studies. It's a real mess. And and all I can feel when I get to meet these people is, man, my heart goes out to you. Like, I may not agree. Obviously, I don't agree with the kind of politics that Hezbollah has been running on, but I feel for you. Like you shouldn't be have to go through this. At the same time, I get to talk, or I get to hear the stories from people who are based in Israel, and I feel like, yes, I mean, this should have never happened. Your society or your community should never have gone through that super traumatic experience of October 7. It just shouldn't have happened. And I'm saying this because, again, in order to get my priorities right, man, in terms of politics and what is really happening behind the scenes and what the real intentions are of the Israeli government or of the Iranian government, I don't know. And there are all sorts of experts who talk, all their wisdom and all their studies and what have you, and all their analyses. And this is certainly, for some people, this is interesting. And it's interesting to me, but I don't want to get sucked into the vortex of just following, trying to analyze this stuff, as interesting as this may be, before I don't get to, again, commit to try and love my neighbor, whoever they are, on whatever side of the conflict they're standing. That is our responsibility as followers of Christ, to love our neighbor and to make, as Jesus showed in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's my responsibility to make people my neighbor. As the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan reached out to that guy. It is my responsibility to make the people who are the farthest away from me, socially or culturally or ideologically, these guys, it is my responsibility to make them my neighbor. So again, I don't have anything against people who are into analyzing this conflict, and some people are even called to do this. If you're a political scientist or if you work in that field, well, go for it and do your duty as a Christian in being excellent at what you do, for sure. But as far as I'm concerned, with where I see my place, is I just feel like, and I think this applies to every Christian, even if you work in the political sciences or in that sort of field, it's our job, our calling is to love our neighbors, and it really doesn't matter on which side of the conflict they're standing. And so again, I may be blessed to have access to just real life stories, which, as you said, Jacob, at the beginning, again, if you only see the media, it is very hard, and it is very natural to not feel compassionate, because these are just headlines. These are just a bunch of pictures. These are just a bunch of statistics that you're being presented with. But once you actually have access to a real life story, man, your heart will be changed, and you can't walk away from this without, or it's very hard to walk away from this without feeling some sort of compassion and just empathy. Yeah.
And precisely. And when we as Christians come to the table to talk about the problem of evil and suffering, for us, we don't come with just an explanation or just a way to make this fit with the puzzle piece that is God, to make it a fuller picture. We come to the table knowing that this is not how it should be. We come to the table knowing that this is a fallen world that is awaiting redemption, that all of nature and all of creation groans for that final redemption, when Christ will rule as Lord over all, exercising all authority, and the garden that was lost in Genesis will be restored in Revelation. That is the worldview that we are bringing to the table. And so this fallen state should trouble us the most. Politics comes secondary. This fallen state and the pain that we see around us should trouble us the most, because this is not the world where Christ is reigning as sovereign Lord in everyone's heart. He is Lord over all creation, but he is not reigning as sovereign Lord over everyone's heart. That was the way it was supposed to be, where Christ is reigning in everyone as he's reigning in our heart. And I think that should move us to be focusing on what should have been and praying that his kingdom come in all his glory. And I think that should be the key takeaway as we look at these conflicts, at the very least, from a distance at least, or as you tune into this podcast. And I hope that would be your takeaway, that we would, as Lukas reminded us powerfully, that we are called to love our neighbors. That's a simple point. The two laws that Christ says, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. And ever so often we fail to do the second. And thank you, Lukas, for coming on the podcast, sharing your perspective and your sobering reminders on how we are to live out as Christians, not just speaking the truth, but living it out in our daily life as well. And I really hope that very soon you will be able to return back to your normal life, your kids, and everything will be back to normal, and that the peace of God would be prevalent in this troubled region as well. Thank you for joining in, and I hope you also had a very good moment to retrospect into what you have been as a family going through and your Christian perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It was a pleasure, and it was very enriching to have the conversation.
And keep doing the amazing work you're doing in Lebanon. God bless you, brother. And I hope to see more Deflate videos in the near future.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks so much.
And thank you to everyone who joined in. And we will catch you in the next episode. Until then, take care and God bless.